So there was more regarding the countries in China, the European Union. There's the question by one person in the audience, which asked, is there a point of no return in sustainability and recovery of the euro? And adds, do you hold any long positions in any European bonds, hoping that these will strengthen in 5 years or more? And then maybe also a bit more general is the question, we were talking about unemployment as a threat to growth potential. Harsh austerity measures do the same. Why does the Troika not give more time for societies, the Greek for instance, to change their habits rather than
I was going to say that's quite interesting.
cutting them radically?
Maybe the Troika would give people more time, but the markets are reacting. So that's part of the dilemma that we find ourselves in.
I think timing exactly is you've got the kind of politicians on one side and markets on the other, but markets do react to it. I think it brings it back to that point that there's, I didn't quite capture the question, but that the Eurozone in many instances is not fit for purpose, and I think markets would be much more comfortable with some sort of UK-based system or US-based system, which has many of the same pitfalls anyway. So there's
not a perfect.
No, it's certainly not a perfect solution.
I do.
Well, also, I mean, to the question of why doesn't the Troika give more time to Greece, for example? A lot of the changes that Greece has committed to make are actually institutional changes, are changes to the very structure of the economy. You've had very, very significant cuts already to pensions, public sector wages, but where certainly there has been particular cases of the Greeks falling short of what they had committed to do was in the structural measures, things like freeing up closed professions, things like making real changes to the number of people in the public sector who get hired, to actually following through with some changes to labor law. There a lot of these institutional questions are some of the issues. I mean, that's before you even get started on addressing some of the profound problems with tax evasion in Greece, which is fundamentally an institutional problem, and not really addressing it means that the people who have the equivalent of PAYE in Greece are the ones who bear the brunt of the adjustment. And so you have a whole other group of people who still, I talked earlier about changing your view of what the future looks like and how a society or country works. And this is a pretty fundamental part of that. And for some people, they're experiencing the very, very sharp end of this. No one should ever diminish the kind of hardship that ordinary Greeks are experiencing. At the same time, you do still have some people who are clinging to some of the old ways of doing business, whether it's enjoying some of the benefits of closed professions and exploiting some of the weaknesses of fiscal institutions that the country has. And that's something that the Troika giving them more time doesn't really address. These are just institutional changes that are going to be needed, whether or not Greece is in the euro, in order for it to really move forward over a longer time period.
But then surely for Greece to remain in the euro and it to work, then actually more time will enable those changes to eventually come through. I mean, I think that was the aim of the question.
I suppose the question that I would throw back at the questionnaire is, has time really been the problem with the tax evasion issue, with freeing up closed professions? Is time going to be part of the solution to the problem, or is it actually coming to accept that the way in which the economy and the political system have worked isn't a way that's really going to be feasible to work going forward? And that's really, like I said, that's not a question that time will make any easier.
We've seen so many deadlines have been missed by Greece, and they've still managed to get their money in, but there's more deadlines put on. Like, it's part of it because, you said before, I think Michael did, about, the Eurozone, like some big wars that no one's actually steering, like no one and sorting out at the reins. Is that the problem? Do they just think, well, hang on a minute, or say the Greeks, when they don't implement, the harsh austerity terms that they've been given, is it because because there isn't, does the institutional reform need to trickle down from the top?
I think it's difficult because Greece has weak structures that have been weakened by big recessions. So even if you want to implement a lot of the things that have been asked, I'm not sure it's impossible. I think if you have a country that's been broken and gone through the amount of suffering that the Greeks have, I think it becomes, you get to a stage where it becomes hard to implement those reforms because people, you don't have enough control. You can't, you ask people to change, and pass a law that says they have to change, but nothing changes. And that's
Well, I suppose that gets back to the policeman not being able to fill up the cars with petrol. We laugh about it, but it's, it is actually pretty tragic in terms of if we are going to move this forward, you're right, there is a limit to what austerity measures will achieve for certain. Do you have more questions?
Yes, there is quite some questions coming in now. I think there's two very interesting ones about markets in general. One person asked, if the markets are the problem, then what is the solution? And the second, market sentiment and actions are discussed as if rational or fundamental. He questions whether they are. Should the markets be accountable for the impacts in the social movement?
No, should the markets be accountable? Sorry,
yeah, well, basically, I think the point of the question is, as in how should we take the markets into account? Is there any side anything we can do on the side of defaulting?
Can I clarify? The question is, it goes to your comment about the horse that nobody's riding, but everybody's steering. And the question is, if the should markets be accountable? It always amazes me that the BBC talk about the market makes it as what the markets will think. Oh my goodness, there's a gorilla, there is a wild animal called the market. What will it say about this thing that's part of the gorilla? It seems to be a complete fixation. The question is, we've constructed a society here, a global civilization, and we are now somehow controlled by this mad force that nobody's controlling. The question is, should the market be accountable, and if so, should it be?
That's very interesting, this question, because sort of in terms of the accountability issue, that if you actually ask somebody in the market, they'll say, well, I'm responsible for the man on the street pension fund, and it's my job to make sure that actually I get the returns that I need to in order to be able to provide the pension that this person is looking for. So it's sort of the market, exactly. So the markets per se are actually, they're a function of our life, and there is a danger in just wanting to nail the blame on someone.
Haven't we created the market by regulation part? I think that what I do agree is that we are talking about these issues if the market were there a priori before us. We came and the market was there, but it wasn't. We created the law in Parliament, the Parliament elected people. So why shouldn't we think about what's the state there for? I mean, why are we destroying the welfare state and accepting unemployment? It's not just what's the best model to fit in the economy. It's what's the state for, what's the economy, what's the social contract behind all of that.
But I think this is exactly what this whole crisis is bringing to a head and forcing people to say, what do we want as a society? And, is the austerity measures, I think there are a lot of elements you can't have. If you look at the pension fund managers, they would tell you they are having a really seriously hard time at the moment, and due to a lot of the regulation that's coming out of Europe, and that is actually hampering their ability to be able to provide the yields and the resources that they need to for their funds. What would you think?
But I mean, there is also a gap. You asked about your population saying, asking themselves what they want in terms of your welfare state, for example. There's also the question, which the pension fund manager has to care about deeply, which is, and what can that state pay for? And this is as much an intergenerational question as anything else, because you also have, we've talked on the margins about labor market reform and about unemployment. I mean, fundamentally, what a lack of labor market reform does is it protects people who have jobs at the expense of people who don't. And one of the reasons why labor market reform like that is so important is that it starts to free up some of these, let's face it, intergenerational inequalities that do develop. And this is one of the issues with youth unemployment being so high. This is one of the issues with a changing social contract. And in some countries, pensioners are experiencing these changes more than others. But certainly, one of the things you can see in country after country is that young people in Europe who are just coming out of secondary school or higher education are certainly experiencing this changed social contract in a very, very deep way.
And the implications that will have for society as a whole. So,
I was going to, back in 2010, Germany banned sovereign CDS unilaterally, but the big only act in Germany wanted to try to team up the French and do it European-wide. And the idea being that CDS, which is sort of a contract on, like an insurance contract on government bonds, essentially you can say, if this government bond fails, then I will get paid back. But you can also, unlike an insurance contract, you don't have to have the bond in order to trade it. So you can short government bonds very easily. It's a derivative contract. It's very liquid and very flexible. And the Germans felt that sovereign CDS were essentially a predatory implement, and that was forcing the costs up for borrowing and damaging Europe, and therefore should be banned. Now, so I wrote this paper called "Don't Blame the Mirror for Your Ugly Face," which I got in so much trouble politicians got angry, journalists got angry, lots of people got angry, actually including a few academics here. And what I was trying the point I was trying to make in this paper is that markets have this reputation for acting in a predatory fashion, and for sure there are people that want to try and make money and want to try and force a situation in order to try and profit from it. And that's what makes markets liquid. That's what makes markets active. And the point being that if these guys are wrong, if these hedge funds that are speculating are wrong, they will lose money. They'll go out of business. There won't be hedge funds anymore, right? So it's not that. It's not the instrument. It's not the sort of activity of trading. It's sort of to make to provide people that want to come and lend money to companies. You need to have this sort of market to make it liquid, to make it tradable, to be able to hedge it, to be able to do other things with it. And they sort of go together. You have to a certain extent accept the bad with the good. Now, you can look at market abuses, and you can say that this sort of activity in which maybe groups of hedge funds gang together and try and unfairly influence things. Now you can eliminate that sort of market abuse. You can try and eliminate other forms of abuse, but I think you have to allow people to buy and sell freely. Otherwise, you end up with something completely different.
And I think actually you touched on a point there. The over-regulation that we've seen is actually, if you look at fixed income markets, what they're trying to put onto the fixed income markets at the moment, will really hamper investment in actually companies. And if you're looking at corporate bonds, if you're looking at sovereigns, then there are consequences. And whilst I do understand that it does appear that this beast is running amok, there are methods that need to be taken to do this, to allow an evolution to take place, rather than just slamming the lid down on the markets per se. But I know that there's a gentleman who's been exceptionally patient at the back. He wants to make a comment.
So the question is, it's not a thing that we discovered suddenly yesterday that Greece operates differently economically to Germany. Right? We've known this for decades. So if some fund manager is investing in Greek bonds, assuming that they're going to be as solid as German bonds, just because they're in the same currency, doesn't he deserve to have that default and for him to lose his job?
Yes.
But that's absolutely, I mean, that has to be the premise of a free market, because otherwise then you have kind of markets and governments also taking over, what happens, so that, no one's actually taking any risk except the taxpayer. So I think that's one thing that we've probably learned from this crisis, is that the taxpayer takes a hell of a lot more risk, probably when they don't even know that they're doing it. And that's something that has to change in a big way, because I'm sick of paying for it. I think probably a lot of other people are too.
So you felt that instead of the premise where the problems that we now face initially come in the wonderful periods of growth that we had before, because
Sorry, we can't, sorry.
So if you look over the last, let's say 8 or 9 years ago, we had the overall philosophy, both at the individual and governmental level, that you need to make money work. So you borrow more, you invest more, you make that grow. And governments have been brought to a point where they've applied that in their finances. So if you look at the GDP and the budgetary deficits, you'll see that almost all governments rely on refinancing their debt at shorter and shorter intervals in order to be able to provide continuous growth. Now, the problem is, why did this work until 3 years ago? I'm not going to argue that it's a good model or not, but it did work. And why did it suddenly stop working? Because if you look at it, the changes, for instance, in the ratings provided by the rating agencies preceded the dramatic market events. So is there causation? Is there just correlation? And who are we to blame for?
Sarah, do you feel that's directed at you?
Well, I mean, one of the first things I would say is that the market might have considered the riskiness of Greek debt to be not materially different from that of German debt, but we certainly never did. Markets can undershoot and they can overshoot. And one of the things that we try to provide in a rating system is looking over at a longer term view at the fundamentals, at what this means for credit risk. And as I said earlier, the fact that a government's bonds are no longer considered a risk-free asset is a pretty fundamental change to its credit profile. It affects its access to financing, it affects the kind of susceptibility that it experiences to event risk. And this is really a change of mindset in the markets, and I suppose we could debate all night why that happened. Maybe it's because the financial crisis that erupted in the banking sector caused people to wake up to the existence of risk, not just in housing markets, for example, but also for sovereigns. There are plenty of hypotheses that you can put out there, but the simple fact is that there's some risk that wasn't being priced before, and we're now going through a fairly prolonged pricing of that risk, and it's almost inevitably going to be a painful and sometimes disorderly process.
So essentially, are we talking, Europe's leaving 2008 though?
I wouldn't use that analogy. It's again a fundamental change about the expectations that people have about the way the world works. One of the fundamental expectations about the way that sovereigns work that people held for a very long time was that rich countries don't default. There hadn't been a rich country default since the end of the Second World War. That is clearly with the Greek default in the past. And that's a really big change in mindset. And the fact that this can happen then has an impact not just for the credit risk of Greece, but it then causes the market to think, okay, well, if there's one sovereign, i.e. Greece, that had these problems that can default, are there others? And then it thinks about this risk in a different way. And again, that sovereign debt is then not considered risk-free anymore.
That's true, but then you go from 5% yield to 1,000% yield in 6 months. How does that work out again? I mean, you realize there's some risk. So as part of realizing there's some risk, you bring the whole system down.
Who brings the whole system?
Well, you say, so we're talking about the markets, right? Talking about the markets, talking about individual players in the markets, but these players, like pension funds that you brought up earlier, they have to look at rating outputs in order to be able to enter or not in some transactions on those underlines. So the minute, for instance, that you sense a danger on the long term for those credits, you downgrade the rating, they can no longer trade, they're forced to sell, it automatically provokes an impact on the markets, and the impact is partially provoked by your decisions themselves. So how can you, look, when you have the tip of an iceberg, it just takes one little push of gravity to take over. So why did we allow this to depreciate the way it did? Because there's no way Greece was 200 times more dangerous in 6 months. It's still the same Greece. It's still under the sun. It's still all is boiling. So what's going on?
I don't think Sarah can actually respond. Yeah, okay, you don't say what it's
I find it very interesting this point of risk-free assets. Very,
Okay, I find really interesting these things on the risk-free asset and how the whole idea about a sovereign state not being able to default any longer came about. I think that one of the big changes has been what's a sovereign state. I mean, we are having a situation in which there's a currency without a proper political union behind. It's something like not really that many precedents in history. I mean, money came about as a form of social control. When grain couldn't be stored any longer for taxes, then we created money. But there was a sovereign body taking political decision behind it who had coercive force on the state. That's something missing in Europe. We've got finance ministry meeting up, we've got European Commission, but there's not one political body behind it taking proper decision for the currency. As long as we don't solve the idea of having a currency with like no one taking a proper decision for it, politically based, we'll always have an open window for speculation. We'll always have an open window for crisis.
But then that goes back to the issue about, do you have democracy or do you have a super state that just tells everybody what they're doing? And this is what's happening in the financial markets at the moment.
Oh, but we are somewhere in between. We've got national problems, which have national solutions. Some are coming from Italy, and like some of the things which are happening in our backyards are coming from our history. There's no euro to blame for our ugly face, if you agree. but then still, some of these things cannot be resolved on a national basis. Some other comes from an international base. Like a very nice harmonization of languages might be very nice, but we started with the whole idea of having Europe without really knowing what we were doing.
Yes.
And now we should realize what we have done. And stop to think about what we should have been doing before and realize what we can do right now.
I think that the markets are one step ahead of that, in that sense, because they are trying to put Europe into a construct or into a structure that they understand, which is where Germany is the leader. And that's why Germany can borrow at negative interest rates. And Greece is at, God knows what their two-year bond yield is these days. But that's why Spain is at, 7.6% tonight.
What should be the direction on the political agreement behind the currency?
You need to have a structure like that. You can't have it flat. It has to be some sort of pyramid structure where someone does take the chance. And right now, I think, certainly from the market perspective, what the market's saying, they like the way the northern core do business. They should be the ones who are leading to some extent.
But then it goes back to the problem where you've actually got the situation that you are going to have to impose on the southern states.
Yeah, of course. So
Which is
it's
not
necessarily
that
happen.
just will not work. Not without massive social unrest.
I'll just add in one last thought on that same point, which is one thing is for sure, if you look at the last 10 years, is that we've all existed with too much credit. Credit's been too easy, there's been too much of it around, and the sort of growth rates that it's creating were never sustainable. So I think we have to be prepared to accept that whatever the solution we find, that it probably means lower growth rates, it probably means less credit availability. We're talking about markets and thinking about them. I was in the FT this morning, not on the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of perhaps we need a few, we need fewer golden geckos out there. We need to focus more on to have some restrictions that prevent public inflation, some restrictions that prevent some of the worst excesses of markets, but yet enable markets to provide funding. I mean, for instance, we consider things like asset-backed securities, which were considered to be the villain. Actually, they're the one things that are doing quite well, and we're recommending as an investment to some of our funds. Things like UK prime residential mortgage-backed securities, and also backed securities, credit card-backed securities. These sorts of innovations weren't evil in themselves. I mean, they got out of hand and they gained leverage. But that doesn't mean we should sort of say we can't have, let's go back to plowing a field by the horse. You can still have financial innovation, but control on the limits. So slightly fewer ordinators don't lose innovation and probably get used to world investment.
What was it Lord Turner said? Banking needs to get boring.
Banking needs to get boring.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, I want to make a few comments on the back of one or two of the things that he said. Just so you know, I'm Dennis Scotch Bristol Reward Limited, and I'm actually a political economist. I've been advisor to two governments. I'm a two lessons for a living and advise governments around the world on this crisis. First, I want to correct a couple of things that I've been quite correct on that have been said from around the group. I do not want you to think that fund managers thought that the UK government, the American government, or the Greek government was risk-free 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years ago. That is just not true. I said we recognise the weakness then, we know it now, the progress is always there. The difficulty of an economy like Greece is when it lost its primary industry, it didn't find a replacement. And if you're a young person in Greece and you come out of university, you know what you have to do. You move to Germany, you have no option. So you are just not going to do not going to stay with the now funding, it's just not going to happen. What you have to look at in terms of the euro is if we were to get currency union in a full way and we were to get political union, then would that be good for a young person in Greece? And actually, unless there's a continual transfer of assets, it will not be good. Because you do not have an environment in which it's actually a sensible place to invest. You don't have a good agricultural sector, the land is poor. You do not have a good infrastructure, the roads are poor, the railways are poor, the investment has not been made. So if I'm going to have a social contract with the individual that just transfer money which is effectively spent, then I do not create growth in society and I just end up in a continued downward spiral. Now, this is not the only country in the world that has this problem, and of course we've had major industrials that have failed before. And you look at the Russian crisis of 1999, which arguably has created the entire crisis that we now have, and you say, yes, you can have a problem. Now, what happened there was 150% interest rates, 85% of banks failing, 90% of wealth disappearing. Is that acceptable in European context? If you come to the conclusion the answer is no, then what you're saying is we need to have a transfer of assets from the north of Europe to the south forever. Now, is that a problem? Now, you have to think about like the American currency and compare New York to Alabama and say, well, how come Alabama doesn't default within dollar zone? Or you look at the UK and say, how come Yorkshire doesn't default or Wales doesn't default within sterling zone? And of course it's transfer of assets long-term with political acceptance. We don't have that political acceptance in Europe. If we do get that political acceptance, and about 250 billion every year transferred from the north to the south, then they can stay within the currency zone forever. But that kind of a decision's never been made, and I don't think anyone's signed up to it yet. So we've now reached that tipping point, and when we're talking about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is one of the issues that we're discussing, of which one is Europe. And it is not the only one. There are three other horsemen which will make sure that if we were riding the euro currency properly, that we would be pushed off it on a regular basis. Regrettably, what we're doing is we have a fire and we're trying to put it out by pouring petrol on it. And that means every time we try to recover, we get slapped back down again. Which means I regret 15 to 20 years of austerity. Going back to your point about why did it work and it doesn't work anymore, is because when interest rates were declining for 20 odd years, then of course it could work because the leverage stops hurting so much. But now you've reached an environment where you expect next year on balance interest rates are probably going to be higher than they were the year before. 5 years ago you thought they were probably going to be lower. And all of the rules and regulations in the world are pointed the wrong way. Which idiot is going to buy government security